Hello, everyone. Welcome to Fired Up, the podcast for marketers working in early and late stage startups. Hello there, everyone. Welcome to Fired Up, the startup marketing podcast. My name is Morgan McClintic, and today I'm joined by my co-host, Chris Albrecht. Hey, Chris, how are you?
Hey, great to be here.
Well, today is a very exciting day because this is our 100th episode, Chris. So we've been doing this for a couple of years.
Incredible to think. Time has really flown on this. I thought maybe a year, but yeah. Crazy.
It's brilliant. So I've really enjoyed that. And guess what? To celebrate that, we have invited back our very first guest, Anthony Shaw, who's a naming expert from Operative Words, the founder of Operative Words. Anthony, it's great to have you back. Our very first return guest. So not only the first, but the first return. It's great to see you.
Thanks so much, Morgan and Chris. I'm honored to be back with you today.
Brilliant to have you. So we are going to catch up on the last couple of years. We're going to be talking today about naming, particularly in the AI era, because if I think back, a couple of years, AI was just coming out. Now it's had a major impact, and we want to sort of dive into that. So look, sort of at the start here, why don't you catch us up on some of the latest trends in naming over the last couple of years since we spoke?
Well, companies have, by and large, as I've seen it, done a pretty good job of naming. They've been bold. They've been using interesting real words. There's a lot of humanistic naming that's going on. They're not trying to sound super technical or science fiction. They're using real words. They're using meaningful and often emotive words. And I applaud them for doing that. This is a trend that continues because you have a company that does one thing and it does well, and then other companies follow suit. So I'm grateful to see the proliferation of interesting real English word names that are out there now. A lot of names are metaphorical, which I think makes for very deep and interesting names that can contain a whole story in just an utterance. And I'm grateful that there's limits on misspellings, that companies have demonstrated discipline, and it seems that they're not feeling like their domain has to govern what their actual name is, because that desperation for a domain seems to influence why they would misspell a certain word. And it's nice to see that companies aren't doing that as much as they used to. They seem to know that customers will find them by using a search engine, not by typing in their whole URL. Who does that? Nobody does that. So I applaud the wisdom that's proliferated throughout the marketplace and applaud these companies and founders.
How do you think AI search might change founders' thinking? Is it going to accelerate that, or is it going to remove that worry that you need to have the meaning of the company inherent in the name, just because the AI is going to be better able to sort out what someone is looking for? I would imagine it would, in a lot of cases, even be able to figure out what you were asking for, even if you misspelled it.
Yeah, AI does an extraordinary job of knowing what your intention was, even if you misspelled it. And I believe that the top level domain, the .com or the .whatever, is going to matter even less in the future with AI, because what AI is going to be concerned with is the clout, validity, and the perceived expertise of a specific domain by virtue of how others refer to them or link to them. And so to that extent, I think spelling is going to matter very little, and the top level domain is going to matter very little. But the AI has to learn about you and know about you, and it's going to learn that by virtue of how others are talking about you as a company out in the internet. And so that's where that credibility and that expertise is going to end up getting you recorded in the AI and put there for posterity.
You also mentioned metaphor as an effective and powerful approach to naming. This is something I often wonder about. Do you think that when someone hears a brand name that includes a metaphor or is built around a metaphor, do you think on some level they're unconsciously unpacking it? Are they registering the metaphor, even if they're not thinking it through in the moment? Does it carry some kind of weight at a sort of semi-conscious level, or what makes it so effective?
Well, metaphors are effective because they pack a lot of information into a single word. There's often layers and stories or connotations that are embedded into that simple idea. And so when someone is exposed to a name that's a metaphor, the metaphor is going to really lean forward. It's going to be prominent in the thinking, and the brain is going to try to assess, make a connection between the metaphor and what that company does or what that stands for. And so that's an initial impression that's going to happen. Now, over time, as a person engages with that company or its products, the metaphor may matter a little bit less over time because your own experiences are going to govern what your perception is of the company. So, as an example, just think of an obvious and well known one is Apple. You just heard about Apple for the first thing today. You might think, what's it about? Knowledge? Is it about fruit? Is it about what is it? But now you don't think about apples at all. The metaphor takes a back seat to whatever your own impressions of the brand are. That's going to dominate your perception moving forward. But a metaphor can be a very helpful way is sort of being a verbal handshake, introducing yourself to someone and getting you engaged and getting you thinking about them.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think as we talk about specific brand names a little later on in the show, I think we're going to come back to that idea.
Yeah, and so you're talking to us from a very nice balcony here in San Francisco, a rare sunny day. Since we chatted, there's been a lot of new AI companies minted. We've seemed to have got all of our vowels back as well in those names, which is good to see. But what have you noticed about the names of all the, specifically about the AI companies?
Well, I think by and large, there's some interesting things going on with AI company names. They're using real words, they're using words ripe with meaning. There's not a lot of made up words. They're not trying to hide behind a word that doesn't have much meaning. And I appreciate that these companies are doing that. As some examples, we've got OpenAI, which is really interesting. I think that some AI companies name themselves kind of as an antidote to a pain point.
Right.
Right. With OpenAI moving away from a sense of something that's closed off to others, something that feels maybe like a nod to open source kind of ideas, something that feels a little more altruistic, or a company called Safe Super Intelligence, who's really leaning out there to try to countervail the notion
Yeah.
of Terminator type connotations out there. I named an AI company a while back called Taut, T-A-U-T, and they use non-large language model as a means of having intelligence. It's a totally different model because large language models are really bloated, inefficient, energy inefficient, and inefficient in lots of ways. So Taut as a name is a way of being an antidote and a suggestion of doing something very, very differently what's typically done out there. So I appreciate that these companies are doing things that feel a little bit more human. You've got a company like Anthropic who's really leaning into that quite expressly. And for a long time, we've had AI agents name themselves after people. Alexa, Siri, there's a company called Harvey out there, right? There's an AI company called Artisan. So they're imbuing themselves with humanity because there's a recognition that there's still nothing smarter than the human brain. And so they lean into this. An AI company, a chip maker I named a long time ago, their name is Mythic, because I really wanted to lean into what's like the consummate pinnacle of human creation as a way of suggesting what's capable with AI. So I applaud this wave of companies that are using these humanistic and human oriented metaphors as a way of naming themselves.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned Artisan because they also made themselves famous by saying through their billboards, don't hire humans. And I think everyone was sort of upset about that, and that helped them get their Series A, which they also announced over a bunch of billboards. Tell us a bit about, though, I'm sure that the practice of naming has also been impacted by AI. How's the sort of art and science of what you do on a day-to-day basis changed with AI?
Yeah, that's certainly a topic amongst namers and
I'm
non-namers
sure.
alike, right? I started studying AI back in 1986, long before large
Mm.
language models. So I go way back with AI, and I'm a computational linguist. I do a lot of work with different computational linguistic tools and corpus linguistic engines and tools. So I'm a fan of software, right? I have long used it as an adjunct to my brain for creative development, and that includes AI. Before OpenAI and GPT came out, I was training my own large language models, collecting data and training it themselves using Python and other systems. The creative power of AI as it stands today still can't match what people can do. Large language models are, by their very nature, derivative. They're a prediction engine, is really what they are. And therefore, they tend to create things that feel familiar. They can feel trite or corny. So their ability to create something truly original is compromised. And I don't mean necessarily making up words. I'm just talking about coming up with interesting metaphors that are breakthrough. And right now, AI can't do that. So I would think that within a couple of years, it may be capable of doing that. I kind of hope it is. But right now, it can't do that. Now, AI nonetheless is useful. There's namers I know, and I use it too for doing a lot of groundwork exploration, sort of doing metaphor exploration or looking for examples of something within a certain domain, dredging up a whole corpus of sort of jargon or language within a certain field, exploring territories without actually doing the naming. Right. So I find that it's very useful and setting the groundwork and developing springboards for creative development that would be done by a human like me or someone on my team. AI is also useful for doing audits of categories. So for identifying, tell me all the companies within a certain category. I think it's very useful for doing that and then helping you as a namer identify where some white space might be, where some areas of opportunity can be. So it's a useful tool, but it's not executing the creative development yet in a way that is original and useful. It's also not able to do trademark screening yet. It may be able to do some desktop screening to find if there's potential conflicts, but I haven't found it's very useful because it misses too much.
You've flagged a particular phenomenon called the cliffhanger name. Talk a bit about that if you could.
Sure. Cliffhanger names are interesting to me because they are names that are missing something you expect to be there. So a cliffhanger name is one that is abruptly truncated, where you expect a complete phrase or idea, and that's been cut short, leaving you as a reader the role of having to fill in the blank. It's a name that's unresolved or otherwise incomplete. And this is an idea that was drawn to my attention from a colleague of mine, Caitlin Barrett, and she
Mhm.
called them unfinished names. I call them cliffhanger names. And so there's a company out there, Joni Ives' company, Love From, is
Yeah.
an example of that. Love From, having a preposition in there with nothing else. It needs something and it's not there. There's a clothing brand called Of Origin, which also has that sense that something's missing, and it creates a
Mm.
tension there. There's a company called Strategy and, you
Yeah.
need to fill in the blank. And the brain can't stand that kind of incompleteness. And so it compels you to make that connection yourself. So it makes for something that's very engaging. And frankly, that unsettling quality is also makes it very memorable. And this is actually, there was research that was done on this in the 1920s. A Soviet psychologist named Bluma Zagarek, who noticed that waiters remembered unpaid orders more than paid ones. And once the bill was paid, that person was forgotten. And so this hypothesis came up that when there's an incomplete task, it kind of irritates our brain and there's unfinished business there, right? So these cliffhanger names stick around and they create an increased cognitive load. That is, they force you to think and engage more. There's cognitive disfluency there, something that paradoxically makes names that are engaging and memorable, and yet they're kind of irritating. So that unexpected nature makes them, one, less prevalent. So they're
Yeah.
more differentiated, more likely to be legally available. It also makes them more memorable. They feel very untraditional. So you might not expect a name like this from a very large mainstream company, but from a new startup, a name like that is really going to stand out and signal that they're doing something different. They are demonstrating a point of difference, and they're demonstrating points of distinction just by virtue of the type of name that they chose to use.
That's so interesting and counterintuitive in a way, and yet also makes perfect sense. I think it points up something really interesting and sort of deeply important about the difference between writing for brand and writing for running prose. Because when you're writing an 800-word article, you're prioritizing clarity and speed, and you don't want the reader to stick usually on any given word. That old advice to kill your beauties, right? You don't want your prose typically to be showy. You want to communicate and move on, keep the flow going. But, it sounds like what you're saying is in naming, it's actually important to create a little bit of productive friction because that's what makes the names stick in someone's mind, makes them mull it over. You actually want to create a bit of cognitive load. And it's just, I spend so much time when I'm doing writing for clients thinking about how to reduce cognitive load. So it's fascinating to me to think about this as an instance where you actually want to heighten it just the right amount.
That's absolutely right. And the naming context will matter too, because if you have a new startup company name, for example, you really want that cognitive friction. You want that disfluency because, again, it's going to get attention. It's going to make you lean in and want to learn more. There's other types of company names where clarity actually is important, where you have a whole portfolio of products and you want to help people understand what the differences are between these products and help them choose the one that's right for them. So the name may have a different role depending on whether it's a corporate name, a product name, whether it has to be part of a portfolio of other names, who the competing names are, and so on. So really the role of the name is going to govern what kind of style is optimized for that. And in fact, if you are a very large company and coming out with a product, very often you want something with lower cognitive fluency because you want something that feels immediately trustworthy and comfortable. And if you've got enough heft to put it out there with a lot of mass to get a lot of attention, then you'll be able to capture your audiences and reinforce a sense of comfort and trust and so on. Whereas if you're an upstart startup, then you'll get lost in that noise and you need to have your name work a lot harder and do something that's unconventional. So it's not necessarily cut and dry that you want cognitive disfluency in your name or a tagline because the same principles apply there. It's really going to depend on the nature of are you young or are you very well established? Do you need to grab people by their throat or do you need to help them quickly choose what's right for them? So that context should really govern what the form style of your name should be.
So in that context, or with all that in mind, where would you put the naming conventions that ChatGPT uses, where you have what look like, a sort of symbol salad of 4.0, oh 03, oh 03 Pro, oh 04 mini high? I mean, none of that is really communicative in any sort of intuitive way. From a naming standpoint, I mean, just how does that all strike you?
Yeah, where would I put those names? I would put them in the rubbish bin.
Okay.
That's where they belong. They're crap. For a company that has software that I think is awesome, the way their naming convention fails so utterly is baffling to me. Their product working great, but this other stuff, the naming, it just doesn't make any sense to me. I think that they're talking to themselves. Using an O instead of a zero is too clever by half. It's really hard to tell the hierarchy here. I'll say a lot about the product that I like, but not their naming convention. It's very disappointing what they're doing because it doesn't rise to the caliber of the product itself. Now, you look at another company with Anthropic and what they're doing, I think they're doing a much better job
Right.
with naming, where they have Claude, which evidently is named after Claude Shannon, the father of information theory, I'm presuming. So, they're using a person's name there, and that's a well worn convention, right? Like we see with Siri and others. But then they have different versions. You have haiku, sonnet, and opus. And I think that's a pretty elegant way, a literary way of getting to hierarchy there, where you have haiku, which is short and well defined with type parameters. Then you have sonnet, which is also well defined, but a little longer. And then you have opus, which is much bigger and tends to suggest a culmination in some artful body. Moreover, I'll point out that they're using these human art forms, writing forms, as a metaphor to stand in for what these tier names are instead of just using numbers. So they're amplifying this idea of the power of humanity, the power of human creation in their system. And so I think that they've done a very good job in contrast with what GPT has done with their nomenclature system.
Yeah. And the very name, the fact that we're now having to keep saying Chat GPT as a brand name.
Yeah, that's not great either. It's a mouthful, and unfortunately, in French, it happens to sound like something unfortunate in French too. I mean, that's going to happen in French. Anything is going to sound off. Double entendres are a sport in French. So, but it's just unfortunate also that GPT is fairly long, and it doesn't mean anything to anyone except people in the know.
That's right. So you also, talking about product conventions, you also flagged that Delta Airlines has different seating tiers. And look, the airline industry is trying to price to perfection different options of comfort that we want. So I guess there's a strategy behind them naming their different levels. But here they are. I think there's something like 11 of them. There's Delta Main Basic. There's Delta Main Classic, there's Delta Main Extra, there's Delta Comfort Classic, there's Delta Comfort Extra, Delta First Classic, Delta First Extra, Delta Premium Select Classic, Delta Premium Select Extra, then Delta One Classic and Delta One Extra. So what do you think of those?
My head reels. I pity their customers for having to make any sense of this. Well, first of all, there's a lot there, right? It's just the quantity is a lot to manage, right? Now, if you're hardcore Delta, maybe that doesn't bother you, because anytime you're really deep in a domain,
Yeah.
you can hold a lot in your head and you can make different distinctions, in the way people do with sports or any kinds of domains that are of particular interest. But for someone casual, it's too much. There's also, I feel like, a lack of clarity on the hierarchy here. Is Delta One better than Delta First? Where does Premium Select fit with respect to this whole hierarchy here? I guess Basic, Classic, and Extra are okay from a hierarchy system. I guess it's unfortunate that Basic has taken on a new meaning in younger generations for something that really means suboptimal or like undistinctive. But I've got real concerns with how this is going to work from a customer facing standpoint. How do you choose? This is what nomenclature is for, to help people understand how your products are different from one another and help choose the one that's right for them. And this nomenclature system just doesn't do it. It's really some problems with the hierarchy, and I guess you just go on price to use that as your metric for which is better than any of the others. But the value proposition in these names, it's absolutely opaque.
I totally agree. And so in the way that sort of Anthropic, they've got Haiku, Sonnet, and Opus Utility. If you think about them, right, they make good sense to me. These ones don't. If you're going to have different tiers of products, you have to make it clear to someone who comes in cold, where they sit. And so they're not spending time on that and trying to understand.
And you don't have to come up with interesting words like haiku-san. You just need to do a job with your modifiers and descriptors and your tiering system in a way where you can lay them out. Imagine each one is on an index card and you scramble them up and then say, order these by price.
Yeah.
People should be able to do that by looking at the words alone.
Totally agree. So as a bit of fun, we've been talking about some AI company names or recent company names. So we thought we might just sort of, list a few high-profile tech companies and sort of get your quick take on it. We've already mentioned this first one, Anthropic.
Yeah, that's a lovely name. It's smart. It's a Greek origin word, which is going to connote intelligence, science, that kind of thing. And by the way, I know that people don't know Latin from Greek, but you kind of do, whether you know it or not, right? I can say a hearty welcome versus a cordial reception. And you're going to be able to tell me that one is smarter, one is more intellectual, one is more feeling, one is warmer, right? So you kind of do, at a certain level, understand the difference between Germanic and Latin and Greek at a certain level, even though you don't realize it. So anyway, I like the intelligence and the message that comes along with Anthropic, and I appreciate that. It's original. It's a real word, but, it's untapped. So good for them.
And keeping that on that theme, astronomer.
Yeah, astronomer's an interesting name. They're in the AI space. I appreciate that they're looking at a metaphor there, that there's something going on about someone who is seeking out things that are out there, sort of looking into the future, or I guess you're looking into the past if you're looking at the stars, technically. But it's also anthropomorphized. People are astronomers, and so there's sort of a sense of an agent and someone who's doing something that's looking at the stars. When you're looking at the stars, you're hopeful, it's optimistic. So I see a lot of layers of meaning going on there with astronomer. Even if it's metaphoric and non-literal, that's fine, because with these companies, you don't have to have a name like that. You have a name that's non-literal and you get people to lean in and they want to learn more.
Right. You just get Gwyneth Paltrow to explain what your company does. And the next one here is Bumble.
All right. Well, I know Bumble because I met my wife on Bumble. So I love Bumble because Bumble brought me and my wife, Alex, together. And, at first I didn't quite understand the name, if I'm being honest. There was a sense of kind of something stochastic about it, like you're kind of bumbling along.
Yeah.
Maybe there's some humility to it. And then I think more about it. It's like bumblebees, you go from place to place, you try different things. There's kind of a self-effacing humility to the name Bumble. It's not trying to puff itself up to give a sense of perfection or getting it right every time. There's a humility to it, and I really appreciate it for that. And of course, once you have a good experience with a product, its name will become ever greater and ever more meaningful and ever more positive for you. So I've got nothing but great things to say about the name Bumble. If you're listening, thank you for introducing me to my wife.
That's true. And you compare it with something like Tinder, which to me evokes heat, right? And that creates a very different expectation about what you're going to experience, right? Like Bumble really feels like a process, and there's some humor in it. Like you said, there's a humility and a humor and a sort of a self-awareness of what the whole process is like. And it's almost like they're communicating, we're in this with you.
Right. Whereas Tinder is a hookup app and it's on the nose for that.
Right, exactly. So here's one that's not on the nose, but very much in the news, which is Elon Musk's Boring Company.
I think Boring Company is a killer name. I wish I named that. I think it's hilarious because they bore holes, they make tunnels, right? And so here you take the literal meaning of boring, like boring holes, and he adopts it, and it is merely descriptive and yet available, and it's hilarious because it's so obvious, and of course it also has that self-effacing quality of going in with this idea of being dull, right? And ordinary, that's, how we often think of the word boring. So A plus name, I think it's fantastic as names go.
They did a great job with that. It's a great company name. What about Chime?
Yeah, Chime is a lovely name.
Hmm.
And isn't that what you want if you're selling tech? I mean, don't you want a name that's appealing, that's not boring or bland, something with color and sound, something with some music to it? I think Chime is an absolutely lovely name. It's a pleasant sound. When we think of chimes like wind chimes, something that's a part of your environment that's pleasant. Doorbells chime, so there's open doors of opportunity maybe connoted by it. So all kinds of layers that go on with that word chime. And it's a word that evokes some immediate positive reaction. And that is pure gold in a brand name. That's a real quality that companies should seek out for their name. I think really no matter what they do, because you instantly have a positive emotional connection to the name. And so you're favorably predisposed to thinking positively and having a positive response.
Yeah, and it occurs to me, I was trying to think, unless it's a wind chime, it's a kind of notification, and I was trying to think of any time when you don't wanna hear a chime, when a chime brings you bad news. Like you said, a doorbell chimes, it's a visitor, "Oh, who is that?" Your instant messenger chimes, "Oh, I wonder what someone has to say." You're curious. So, yeah, it has a lot of positive associations, even beyond just the loveliness of the name and the sounds that it conjures up. Okay, well, let's go from that to a much more hard-hitting name, Databricks.
Yeah, Databricks. That's kind of it's weirdly bold, right?
Yeah.
Because it's descriptive, which would normally make it kind of boring. And, a name like a descriptive name can be a badge of fear that you feel like you have to tell everyone about what you do. But this doesn't do that, right?
Mm.
It does bring in a metaphor using the word brick there, which I think is interesting how it combines the abstract and the tactile together, evokes this idea of being able to create things using data. So I think that's a very interesting name as one that leans more
Mm.
descriptive. I've heard other companies, clients of mine, talk about Databricks as an interesting idea, that there's something appealing about a name that's so strongly suggestive like that, yet is in this interesting sort of space.
Yeah, I agree with that. So I think we've got time for a couple more on this section. How about a company that they compete with, Snowflake?
Snowflake. So I struggle with Snowflake. I'm not the target for them. So I'll show you that. But here in San Francisco in the Bay Area, you see their billboards around, and I don't get it. I do understand the idea of uniqueness, and I
Mhm.
also get the idea that things are ephemeral. Snowflakes melt, snowflakes don't last, there's no permanence to them. Snowflakes are a pejorative for someone who is weak and
Mhm.
someone who doesn't have any kind of constitution or integrity, that they're frail, right? So there's those kind of secondary connotations based on a more modern use of
Yep.
snowflake. So I want to like the name snowflake because I like that it's bold and metaphoric and vivid, but I
Mm.
struggle with it because of all the negative connotations that are around it.
How about NVIDIA? Because it's in some ways probably the most abstract of the names we've discussed so far, and yet perhaps the most famous.
Yeah. Well, so full disclosure, I've done work for NVIDIA. I did work on their product
Oh.
nomenclature system a while back, their alphanumeric system. And I loved working with them. They're really smart. The name NVIDIA, I think it's a name that has done really well. I mean, their market cap shows how the name can totally work. So sometimes it's a little tricky separating the name from the overwhelming and well-deserved success of the company, right? But NVIDIA started out as, basically based on the Latin word for envy, right? And So that was a name I think that may have had relevance from another time. But even as an idea, I think it tried really hard. Is that something you want to tell people how to feel?
Mm.
I'm a little reluctant to tell people how to feel. Sometimes those names feel like they're trying a little bit too hard, you know? They didn't need the name Nvidia to make other companies envy them or to make people who don't use their chipsets envy them, you know? They're kicking ass all on their own. They didn't need their name and in all caps to do that, you know? So honestly, it feels like, I mean, with respect, it feels like it was born a little bit out of, it feels kind of insecure or needy,
Yeah.
you know, to say other people are going to envy us or it has to be in all caps. I really wish that they had more confidence in themselves when they got started with their naming, you know?
Do you think that reflects the sort of gaming culture that
Yeah.
they came out of? I mean, I seem to recall there was an acquisition of the 3DFX technology with Voodoo. And,
Mm.
in the gaming field, you often have these evocative to the point of being sort of silly names.
You know, that may be one reason why the name may have made sense when they came out. And then NV also had some relevance, which I forget right now. And then they found the Latin word NVIDIA and then they respelled it. So it may have made sense in that context. And maybe when it first launched, it made sense, especially from gamer to gamer. That's entirely possible that target, it worked for them. But what that brings forward is an interesting lesson as a company when you're naming themselves is what happens when we pivot? What happens when our market grows? Is this name going to work for an audience where our original audience ends up turns out to be the tiniest fraction of what our future audience is? Right. So it's always important when you're naming themselves. Yes, you have a focus. You want to nail it for what's right in front of you. At the same time, it's important to imagine how could we grow? How could we
Right.
pivot? How could a name that's right for this audience today maybe not work so well for us or really add friction into the future? NVIDIA's done great despite all that, and they deserve all their success because they're making great products. And, you know, the AI of today is running on a lot of NVIDIA chips.
Yeah. Well, that's a great segue to another thing we wanted to ask you about was just what you make. We're talking about pivots here and adapting to new audiences while keeping old audiences. What do you make of the whole, I don't know if you want to call it a debacle, but the shift, like what HBO went through with HBO and HBO Go and HBO Max and all the different changes and retrenchments. And it just seems like their strategy is a jumble.
Yeah, debacle is exactly the word I would use. It was a mess, and it's not great when a company keeps changing everything. It doesn't look good. It's not a good look to investors, and it confuses customers. HBO has been brand gold. It's the OG streaming channel, cable channel. It's not TV, it's HBO. My mom got HBO when it first came out. So you know, I've noted as long as there's been an HBO, but in the process of these acquisitions and happening, HBO got buried by Max at a certain point, and it was always a channel within it. They didn't throw out the baby with the bathwater, but they did shove it into the closet. And I think that was a mistake. They had a proliferation of these different HBOs like HBO Go and HBO Now. When Discovery's content was absorbed, it just became Max, right?
Yeah.
And not a fan of that at all. First of all, what happened to Cinemax? Wasn't that a thing? Is
Mm,
that still a
mhm.
thing? So there was a lack of differentiation there, and I thought possible outright confusion. But I didn't see any problem with, you know, keeping something like HBO Max. You bring people in using HBO, but you have a sub brand kind of treatment there. And then you have the purebred HBO sort of as a channel within it, you know, and do it that way. Frankly, I think from a user standpoint, it would have been better just to keep HBO as its own separate standalone channel. And then maybe you have Max as the Discovery collection of other things and not trying to blend them in the way that they did, trying to make it simpler, but also making it more complex once you get there, because the premium content and the other less premium content is blended together, and that could potentially just undermine the equity of HBO. It's a challenge in a branding situation where you have something that's premium and then you want to bring more value or new value add into it. There's a risk of devaluing your brand to doing that, and you often want to avoid that by creating another brand and let that be more mainstream or more value driven.
So HBO decided to rebrand. Nvidia, when it pivoted to or tapped a new market, a bigger market, decided not to. How does a company decide whether it should rebrand or not?
Well, there's a number of important criteria to decide if you're going to rebrand, because it's a big decision. You need to ask, has your focus evolved? Has it grown or changed in some way? Facebook had to create Meta to include all these different important apps like Instagram or WhatsApp. Federal Express as a name made sense back in the day, but then it outgrew and Federal started having the wrong connotation, so they became FedEx. If you have a merger or a spinoff, that's a place where you would want to rebrand. If there's a merger of things, there's a bank called Fleet Bank, and they eventually became Bank of America. And in fact, Bank of Italy became Bank of America, right? So there are these changes in geography that can cause a rebrand. Opal Fruits in UK changed their name to Starburst, right? So that there's one global name there. That's more efficient, right? Datsun changed its name to Nissan at a certain point to have a global name. Then sometimes there's a problem that happens that's outside of your control. It's a term I call infamicide. That's a death of a brand by infamy. There was a diet candy called AIDS back in the 80s. That was unfortunate, but out of their control, right? There was a pharmaceutical company called ISIS. Obviously, they had to change their name. Aunt Jemima had to change its name. Uncle Ben's changed his name. So due to circumstances outside of control, those brands died due to infamicide. Good reasons to rebrand. Then there's reasons you have to rebrand because your own company screwed up, right? Or did something wrong. So Blackwater has changed its name to Zine Academy. ValueJet suffered a terrible plane crash, and they had to change their name to AirTran. Then you got Kentucky Fried Chicken, who decided that fried food you didn't want to shove that in people's faces, at least metaphorically. And so they changed their name to KFC in most markets, right? And then there's legal reasons you'd want to change your name. So Esso was expanding globally, but they ran into trademark problems in other places. So they had to find a name that was available globally. And so they chose Exxon to go with that. I used to work with a company called Anderson Consulting, who was owned by Arthur Anderson, and they ultimately had to separate due to legal reasons. And I was lucky enough to help direct the rebrand of Anderson Consulting over to Accenture, right? So that's a good reason for a legal change. So there's a lot of good reasons that a company might want to change their name and rebrand, but all the time, I'll get calls from companies that think that they need to change their name. And a couple times a year, I talk them out of a project because that's not the problem. You know, the name isn't the problem. Maybe your product's the problem. Maybe your messaging is the problem, right? Because I'm very reluctant to advise a company on throwing a brand name that has equity and starting from scratch. Sometimes existing name does cause so much friction that it's always going to be a headache for you, and you're better off making that change. So it really is going to depend on the situation as to whether or not a rebrand is right for the company.
Right. I totally agree with you on that last point about, often you'll see marketing leaders come in, I'm going to rebrand the company, I'm going to change the website, we're going to have a new look and feel, like as if that is the main problem. And sometimes it is, but often it isn't. It's a product market fit or some other go-to-market issue that just, this is a distraction, a displacement activity that feels good. And it feels like forward momentum, but actually you're sort of just erasing all the years of investment in that brand name, and you just have to start again. And that does make you very busy, but it might not necessarily move the company forward.
It may not fix the problem. You may still have a product market fit, a messaging fit. A rebrand may not be the right tool for the job.
Totally agree. So just as we wrap here, Anthony, what final advice do you have for companies in this AI era naming their new products or initiatives?
Yeah, I want companies, especially startups, to have courage. I want them to have confidence and courage to believe in themselves, to go bold with a name, even if it feels uncomfortable.
Mm.
Names that have a great deal of meaning, the kinds of names that might be polarizing, the kinds of names where you can imagine it being misinterpreted or someone thinking wrong of it. Well, that's probably not going to happen at all because people choose names and people understand names positively because they know that companies at their essence choose a name for some positive reason. So don't be afraid. Have confidence and let the name you choose be a demonstration of the same kind of confidence you have in your product. You also mustn't let your domain drive your naming decision because your actual domain matters less than it ever has. I understand there's prestige with an exactmatch.com. No one's going to argue that. But hell, TeslaMotors.com ran for years before they could afford to buy Tesla.com. UnitedAirlines.com before they ever bought United.com, right? 98% of people find you through a search engine, and more people are going to find you through AI. SEO matters a lot, and having your content that's valuable, being perceived as an expert out there such that it gets trained by an AI model, that's going to be a lot more important than having the exactmatch.com. You can play with different top level domains besides .com, like .co or whatever, .io, .tv, whatever your domain is. And also, trademark availability is going to matter a lot more than anything else, to be honest with you. You will figure out that domain, but if your name ends up on the wrong end of a cease and desist, it's a no-go. It's going to be a problem for you. So don't think that trademark screening and knockout screening is an afterthought. It should be a central part of your naming protocol as you go into it. And because so many names are already taken, you've got to be so rigorous at your creative development. You can't just pick the low-hanging fruit where other people have gone to find your domain. And I'm afraid that a large language model, ChatGPT, whatever, is not going to help you find a new available name. It's going to give you derivative names that are probably not available and are trite and feel really familiar. And that's not good for you either legally or for creating a name that's going to demonstrate a perceived sense of differentiation. And lastly, give it enough time. Give yourself enough time to first figure out your strategy and your points of differentiation, to do round after round of creative development. You should be developing hundreds and hundreds of names to get to the original work that's likely to be available. I mean, my team and I, we develop always in excess of 1,000 names, for every round of work. Other professional namers worth their salt do that too. So that kind of quantity is necessary to get to the quality. And if you are going to consider a coined name, a new word, a neologism, be really careful about that. But there is a real art to doing that, to creating a made-up word that feels like it's natural, that doesn't feel like some weird planet from Star Trek that might be hard to pronounce, that's missing vowels or has too many consonants. People don't trust those words because they don't feel natural. There's something that happens deep inside us that if it feels like a real word, we're going to be more at ease with it. It's going to be more believable, more trustworthy, more likely to be remembered and talked about.
So Anthony Shaw is a naming expert and the founder of Operative Words. And Anthony, thank you so much for your time today. I think your sort of depth of knowledge just comes and passion are always so clear, and your experience on this is just brilliant talking to you. And I really enjoy that. If people want to reach out to you, where should they go?
operativewords.com. You can find me there.
There you go. He's got all the great words. Chris, Anthony, thanks for your time. And thank you for listening. Hope that was useful for you. If you like that, please drop us a comment or subscribe. And we look forward to seeing you all again next week.